Hey, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Christian, aka I Hate You Dior, and today I'm going to be giving my predictions for UFC Fight Night, Hernandez versus Pereira. I'm going to be giving my predictions on some of the main card fights and a parlay that I've built for you guys that I think is going to hit, and how I am going about forming these parlays. And just letting you guys know, I'm not going over the entire card. I don't really care too much about some of these fights or some of the fighters on them, so I'm going to be talking about the fights that I care about and the fighters that I'm interested in seeing Saturday night. And my picks are Robelis to Spain by KO, Asu Amabayev by decision, Charles Johnson by submission, Michel Pereira by knockout, and Kyler Phillips by decision. I'm also tempted to pick Darren Elkins by sub, but I'm still kind of 50-50 leaning on the fence about that one. Now, as for some of the parlays I made 3 going into Saturday night. The first one I made is a 4-leg parlay at plus 1037. Robelis to Spain by knockout, Michel Pereira by knockout, Charles Johnson by knockout or sub, and Kyler Phillips by decision. Second parlay I have is Michel Pereira to win by KO or submission, Kyler Phillips to win by decision, Charles Johnson to win by KO, TKO, or sub. Third and final parlay I have is Asu Amabayev by decision, Charles Johnson by TKO, KO, or submission, Kyler Phillips to win by decision. Now I'm going to just quickly go over my decision making for some of these picks, starting off with Austin Lane versus Robelis to Spain. Now, Robelis to Spain is coming off a loss against Waldo Cortez Acosta from a few months ago by decision. And Austin Lane is coming off of a brutal round 2 knockout by Janata Deniz. You guys may be wondering why I think Robelis to Spain is going to win by knockout, and it's just because why shouldn't he? So far in the UFC, his last 2 fights have finished in a knockout for him, with the first one being from Justin Tafa in a first-round knockout, and the second one being by Janata Deniz in a second-round knockout. Now, if you guys seen some of Robelis to Spain's highlights, you guys know this guy is a truck, knocking dudes out in the first round. Really, the only person to really give him too much challenge in his MMA career so far was Waldo Cortez Acosta, who had a solid game plan with the wrestling. I think Austin Lane's going to try to incorporate the wrestling too, but that being said, I just don't think Austin Lane's that good. It seems like he's just predestined to get chinned with him being a former football player and going into MMA. So yeah, I'm picking Robelis to Spain, either a round 1 or a round 2 knockout. On the parlay, I didn't really specify a round, but if you are feeling a bit more daring, round 1 knockout gets you a little bit more money than setting it just by knockout. Next is Kyler Phillips versus Rob Font in the co-main event. I have Kyler Phillips by decision. I was a little 50-50 on this fight, but going off of what I've seen from Kyler Phillips in his last fight against Pedro Munoz, he looked really good. He was coming off of a layoff. Before that, he still had some really good wins in the bantamweight division and was looking like a really good contender. On the other hand, we have Rob Font, who hasn't really looked good in his last couple of fights. Had a really good win over Adrian Yanez, but since then has lost in his fights against Corey Sandhagen and Davison Figueiredo. I don't necessarily see him going to sleep, since I think he has a really good chin. He has been in there for 5-round wars, 3-round wars, and he's able to last through all of them. And I don't think really Kyler Phillips is the kind of guy to go out there and get a knockout. He likes to mix in a lot of his wrestling. So I'm just seeing this being a dominant decision for Kyler Phillips, where he mixes in the wrestling and really good striking to get himself the win. So I think Kyler Phillips by decision is a lock. I was a little 50-50 on this, since Rob Font does have moments where he looks really good, but he is a lot older, coming off of 2 losses against Kyler Phillips, who's a lot younger, quicker, hungrier, looked good in his last fight against Pedro Munoz. I just think he's going to be able to out-pressure him and outpace him in this fight, leading him to the win by decision. Up next, we have Mateus Nicolau versus Asu Amabayev. I'm picking Asu Amabayev by decision. Now, I could very well see Asu Amabayev also getting a knockout in this fight, since Mateus Nicolau is pretty chinny. His last fight was a loss against Alex Perez, where he did get knocked out pretty bad. But even then, Asu Amabayev is not really the big power puncher that's going out there to take people's heads off. He's a strong, muscular grappler that likes to take people to the ground and pick them up and throw them around, which is what he did in his last fight against Jose Johnson. I just think he's going to do the same thing against Mateus Nicolau. Mateus Nicolau isn't that big at flyweight. Asu Amabayev is not that big either, but he is a lot stronger. And at flyweight, he's picking some of these dudes up in the grappling exchanges, like Jose Johnson, who is a 6-foot flyweight. He was picking him up and throwing him around like it was nothing. So I'm going with Asu Amabayev by decision. I could see him getting a knockout in this fight, but I think it's a safer play to go for decision. Up next, we have Charles Johnson versus Sumaderji. I'm going with Charles Johnson. I think this is another lock. Sumaderji's not really that good. Sumaderji was supposed to fight Joshua Bamback at 302, but the fight was called off for unspecified reasons. Before that, his last 2 fights, he did lose by sub in his fight with Tim Elliott and his fight with Matt Schnell. Charles Johnson is a pretty good grappler, and he has been picking up his stride recently recently in his last couple of fights, but he's also very powerful for the division, very big, and he's pretty strong with his last fight coming by way of knockout over Joshua Van. I just think that Charles Johnson's going to be bigger, going to be a lot stronger, and he has some knockout power at flyweight. And Sumudaerji's never really had the best chin or the best grappling, so I'm going to go with Charles Johnson by either a submission or a knockout. Now, if you're feeling a little bit riskier, I think I would just make the play straight for submission. But when I'm playing on the safer side, double chance by KO or submission's a really good play to make. That play is at a plus 225, so I recommend going with that fully if you want to be on a little bit more safer side. The only other fight that I really wanted to talk about in depth is the main event, which is Michel Pereira versus Anthony Hernandez. This fight was pretty hard to pick, but after doing my research, I'm going to go with Michel Pereira. Michel Pereira has been on a tear at middleweight with all of his fights since he's moved up, coming by way of knockout or submission. His last two fights were against Ihor Potieria and Mikhail Olajaychuk, and before that he did fight Andre Petroski. Out of all three fights, none of them have gotten out of the first round. He's going out there smoking dudes. At middleweight, he is pretty big, very physical, very strong, very ripped as a middleweight, compared to Anthony Hernandez, who has an amazing gas tank, amazing in the grappling exchanges, and pretty good striking, but he is smaller than Michel Pereira. Michel Pereira, I think, is good enough in the ground that he's going to be able to survive the grappling exchanges and scramble with Anthony Hernandez. And on the feet, I think it's a wash between Michel Pereira and Anthony Hernandez. So far, Pereira's only loss in the UFC come from a DQ from a illegal knee and a decision where he did get points removed, versus Anthony Hernandez, who does have two losses, one of them being a very interesting TKO from Kevin Holland. Only reason I say that this TKO is interesting is that the finish did come by way of a body knee that led to him getting TKO'd against the fence. I could see Michel Pereira going for a really similar sequence, or if they're on the ground scrambling, I could see Michel Pereira locking up a submission. Now, the harder part of this is actually trying to figure out when exactly this is going to happen in the fight, because people are talking bad on Michel Pereira's cardio, saying that he doesn't have a good gas tank, but he has gone 3 rounds into a full decision and has looked good in the later rounds of his fights also. That's not to discredit Anthony Hernandez, who isn't a slouch either. I think if the fight goes to the ground or even in the stand-up, I think his cardio and pace could be a real problem for Michel Pereira in the later rounds if Michel Pereira doesn't pace himself early on and starts to gas out. But if we take that away from the fight and just look at their stats on paper and their previous performances recently, I think Michel Pereira has looked better against similar levels of competition. On top of that, he's also training with better people at better gyms, is a lot bigger and stronger than Anthony Hernandez, is coming out here in middleweight and just beating dudes the fuck up. Doesn't really have any losses in the UFC versus someone like Anthony Hernandez, who did have some moments in his last fight with Roman Kopylov, where Kopylov was catching him on the strikes. And as I mentioned prior, his fight with Kevin Holland, that ended in a body knee TKO followed by ground and pound strikes. So I'm going with Michel Pereira by either knockout or submission in this fight. I'm leaning more so towards knockout. Both Anthony Hernandez's grappling strengths, I could see very well this fight ending on a submission when they're both scrambling on the ground. If you choose to go with the first parlay, which was Robelis de Spain by knockout, Charles Johnson by KO or submission, Michel Pereira by KO, Kyler Phillips by decision. For playing $10, you can get yourself 113. My second parlay, which is at a plus 1257, Michel Pereira by knockout or submission, Kyler Phillips by decision, Charles Johnson by KO or submission. $10 wins you 135 in that case. Final parlay of the night is at a plus 1031. Asu Almabayev by decision, Charles Johnson by KO or submission, Kyler Phillips to win by decision. Some other props that I do find interesting as well are Darren Elkins by submission. I'm not too confident on that, as Daniel Pineda, I think, can find himself a win in this fight, but Daniel Pineda is not that good, is coming off of some pretty bad losses in his most recent fights, hasn't looked good in the level of competition compared to Darren Elkins, who is fighting similar levels of competition, has more wins in his last 5 fights, and in those wins is looking better, especially on the ground. So I think that if Darren Elkins wins this fight, he could very well get it done by submission. Another fight I'm keeping an eye on is the Jake Hadley-Cameron Sutherman fight. Cameron Sutherman is a last-minute replacement. Jake Hadley is pretty good, coming off of a win from UFC 304. Part of me wants to go with Jake Hadley, but there isn't much known about Cameron Sutherman, so for all we know, he could be a very good fighter. But if you want to get some extra cash, Jake Hadley's a good fighter to throw in your parlays. So yeah, that's what I got for UFC Fight Night, Michel Pereira versus Anthony Hernandez. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you're telling these parlays, let me know below. If you like the video, leave a like. If you like videos like these, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on post notifications so that you get notified every time I upload a new video. I am going for daily uploads, if not every 2 days, so keep an eye out for those videos when I upload them. If you agree, leave a comment. If you disagree, leave a comment. If you like the video, leave a like. I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Peace.